It's really great to be here, and thanks to the AETC and the Madison Clinic for inviting me up. It's just lovely to be here. Today I want to talk about something that I started my career with, and it looks like I'm going to end my career with, and that is the issue of stimulants and HIV. So you can see these slides have been looked at by the government. So our objectives today are to understand intersections of stimulant use, mental health disorders, HIV, especially for MSM, understand biological and behavioral impacts of stimulant use in the setting of HIV, understand advantages to reducing stimulant use, especially for MSM, introducing or reinforcing the idea that abstinence is not the only goal that we need here, and to understand treatment approaches, especially for MSM. So why do I focus on stimulant use at the intersection of HIV? Well, one of the reasons is because for 80% of the population who are living with or affected by or at risk for HIV, standard biomedical and behavioral prevention approaches work just fine. We don't need to do anything more to annoy the 80% who are doing just fine. And I use the word annoy purposefully. But for 20%, we need to think about what else we could be doing with this group. So I kind of think about this as disaggregating a strategy to begin thinking about that not every person in the population is equivalent, that you have significant differences between people. And that as we flash forward these 30 years, we start to see that there's been an erosion or there's an unavailability of health resources that are specific to people who have the problems of adhering with HIV care or prevention. We have substance use and mental health disorders that introduce disorder and chaos into lifestyles that make it difficult to comply with treatment or prevention regimens. And we also have this horrible aspect of poverty that is impacting and really concentrating this group of folks. And when you have oxygen, heat, and fuel, then what you end up having is the opportunity for HIV outbreaks. And I think this explains a lot of what we're seeing across the country, not only here in Seattle, which I've been watching your HIV outbreak very closely and with interest, because I think you're at the front end of what we're seeing, what we're going to see in Los Angeles. So, when I say that I'm presenting your data because I'm watching closely what you folks are doing. So one of the things I want to start with, and it's always good to remember when I'm talking with folks who are not addiction specialists, is that it's important to remember that addiction is a spectrum disorder. It's been changed in the DSM-5 to be one disorder called addiction or drug use disorder or substance use disorder, and it has a modifier of mild to moderate to severe. When you think about it, we have people on the left side of this spectrum, in the green side, who use that does not cause problems or don't use a substance. It's kind of fun. That you have fewer people as you move across whose use causes occasional problems that are mild to moderate in severity, somewhat occasionally to frequently, which means that the continued use leads to fun with problems. And then as you move across even further, you start seeing fewer people still being involved with the substance use, that you start reaching the levels of mild to moderate substance use disorder and addiction. And then the advantage of why people use the substance goes away. Fun exits the picture, and now all you just have is substance use with problems. So some smart people defined this using the DSM-5 and said that a way to think about capturing the spectrum disorder is to think about a maladaptive pattern of use. There's no medical treatment, there's no medical test that tells you have an addiction problem. It's all behaviorally defined. So it's not only behaviorally defined, but it also is interpreted in the context of clinically significant impairment or distress. So if you have resources, like you're rich, you can buffer those consequences. And then it's two or more following the same 12-month period. I'm not going to run through these. You know the DSM-5, or if you don't, you can look at the slides later. What you do is you just go through and you figure out how many criteria your patient meets, and then you add up the score. If you get two or more, it's diagnostic. 2 to 3 is mild, moderate is 4 to 5, and severe is 6 or more. In looking at epidemiology, one of the things that was written by my mentors a long time ago about stimulants is, is a drug abuse epidemic, is it an epidemic if it doesn't include a major East Coast city, which I you don't even need to read the paper, right? It's like, this is my, I learned from each mentor, write a good title. So, and it is true that meth is moving across into general populations and moving into areas where it wasn't before. There's a lot of fun things to think about. Sarah's probably already thinking about this in terms of the distribution networks and the way in which drug is moved around the country differently now than it was 20 years ago. The introduction of fentanyl and the whole idea of how that has made things crazy also is impacting the distribution networks. And we see that for folks who are seeking opioid treatment, you can see that even across the country, there's this increasing rise in the meth mentions for people showing up at treatment, up to over 1/3 now nationally. Well, this is particularly hitting. You remember the first graphic I showed you was the whole thing about poverty, mental disorder, erosion of health resources. These are death indexes these are death cases in West Virginia over time. And you can see from 2012 to 2017, the third wave of the opioid epidemic here is in 2015. And you can see that J curve of going up, showing that is indeed an epidemic. But what is very fascinating is that if you look at 2016 to 2017, and it's continuing to go up, you see this parallel slope for methamphetamine mentions in deaths in West Virginia. West Virginia, a place that's way far away from the distribution networks, right? So somehow or another, the demand for this drug has actually changed the distribution networks in the country. And now we're starting to see parts of the country that have been previously isolated from the meth problem being full participants in the current crisis. Meth deaths in Seattle County, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in King County. You guys know this as well. You probably saw this in the Seattle paper, showing that methamphetamine deaths in 2018 for the first time exceeded heroin deaths. There continues to be about a 24% increase of all deaths due to meth. It's a 1-to-4 ratio still going on there. If you look at treatment admissions in Seattle, in Washington State, for people who are looking for methamphetamine publicly funded treatment slots, you can see from the earlier years of, 2003, 2004, and 2000 on the left, 2014, 15 on the right, you can see here's Seattle, and you can see that it gets darker over here as you move across. You can see there's always an interest in the more rural parts of the state, which is also true in California. Methamphetamine is very popular in rural parts of the state. And in fact, the epidemic with methamphetamine treatment admissions actually is very different from urban to rural. So urban can involve more women, it can involve more MSM, it can involve more infectious disease, whereas in rural states, that's urban, and in rural states, it tends to be people who are bored out of their mind watching paint dry with nothing to do. And there's absolutely, it helps pass the time. So in looking at the drug deaths, what we also see here, this is parallel to what we see in LA County. You can see here that these are the opioid deaths, this bottom red bar. But if you look, here are the methamphetamine deaths in the blue, and then this is methamphetamine plus opioids. So you put together any methamphetamine mention, and you start to get about the same number of deaths in Washington that you see related to opioids alone. And then finally, I was kind of like just saying, I really do watch you guys closely. Your public health here is wonderful. Some of these slides are from your your HIV epidemiology report from last year, which was, I mean, seriously, at the public health department downtown, we were sitting and going, let's just do what they do. So nice job. But really you can see here that, you know, if on the left, we have the prevalence among people who inject drugs for HIV, and you can see that this is MSM and a meth primary drug, and you can see that this is almost 50% of these folks are living with HIV. And over here on this side, these are syringe exchange data from Sarah showing that methamphetamine mentions are continuing to go up in syringe exchange programs. We look at incidence of MSM and methamphetamine. These are the HIV positive folks. These are the HIV negative folks. And you can see here that mentions of methamphetamine are are higher, just as they are in Los Angeles, among HIV positive folks. And you can see here a nice sort of drifting down of newly diagnosed HIV folks with HIV mentions. These are the HIV positive folks who are on your medical management program. We call it the Medical Care Coordination Program in Los Angeles. These data are identical to what we see. We actually see that folks who are in this enhanced medical care program, that meaning that they're viremic regularly, so they get access to a nurse case manager, different sorts of folks to help them get their medication under control, that the one group that you do not see a change in probability of viral suppression is, well, there's actually two in LA. Yours here with methamphetamine users, and the second group is homeless. So obviously there's going to be a lot of overlap between those two, but we see that going on. And you can see that the HIV negative guys in the PRIDE survey and STD clinic patients largely are not using methamphetamine. And here, this is incidence over time. These are MSM drifting down, which is really nice, and really shows a nice way that you've got a comprehensive public health package here to address the problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our data in Los Angeles. Pamina Gorbach, who's a friend of Matt's, and I have been working together on building a cohort of diverse young MSM at UCLA. We're in our 7th year. We have about 544 people enrolled. Just want to kind of go over a little bit of what's happening here. We have 11 seroconverters since we started, and that corresponds to an incidence rate of 3.4%. With 8 known deaths. What we see in our data is that the blue bars are positive, the orange bars are negative, and you can see for cannabis we see a significant and large difference between HIV negative men who are using cannabis compared to positive, whereas it's the opposite relationship here with the meth users, with the positive guys using meth and the negative guys not. Okay, of these 11 seroconverters, 10 seroconverted around meth. So really showing an almost exclusive relationship between HIV negative MSM and methamphetamine infection in Los Angeles. The 11th one got really blotto, like super drunk, like complete blackout for 3 days, woke up in a hotel, went and got himself checked a week later, and he was infected. So, I mean, all of these infections involve substance use of some kind, not much of it injection use. It's mostly sex-related behaviors that happen and are facilitated by methamphetamine. So before we get too far into ain't it awful, let's talk about, why would anybody use methamphetamine? Well, the reason is because since Kathy Reback published her first ethnography on the methamphetamine, the social construction of a gay drug, which you can get online for free, and it's an awesome qualitative examination of the function of methamphetamine in gay men's lives. I recently was just talking to the Ontario HIV network up there, and they were getting ready to do a qualitative exploration of why MSM used methamphetamine in Toronto, Canada. And I was like, this has been written, it's still the same. And the reasons are really important. It's about issues of identity, about being a gay man, being a drug user, having HIV status of one type or another. It enhances sexual functioning. It boosts self-confidence. It increases productivity. It causes weight loss and enhances strong body experiences. It brightens mood, and it helps you live with AIDS and counter the drain on your physical and emotional resources. What could be wrong? Well, we're going to get into that because we're going to play Ain't It Awful for a little now. But one of the big things I really want to focus on before we get too far into the HIV of all of this is the important recognition of the function of the interaction of smoking in these men's lives. Okay, my mother is a smoker. She's dying of tobacco-related illness currently. She's been taken off hospice because she lived longer than 6 months, but she's dying. And so I, as an addiction researcher, we lose 450,000 Americans every year due to smoking-related illnesses. There's a unique and particular association between HIV, methamphetamine, and smoking, particularly in gay men, and I want to kind of start to lay that out. In HIV samples as a whole, what we see is that smoking-related cancers are the #1 reason why people living with HIV are dying right now. It's not AIDS-defined cancers, it's lung cancer. Okay, there's a lot of reasons for that. It's another talk. It's a lot of fun to talk about, but it really is the point that if you've got somebody who's HIV positive, you're going to help their health most by helping them to stop smoking, as well as take their medications. In our M study cohort, we see that about 50% of HIV negative and positive men smoke cigarettes, with a lot of comorbidity of other substance use among smokers. About half reported cigarette and or e-cigarette use. The take home from this slide is, why are younger gay men engaging cigarette use? I think that's something that the qualitative researchers in the group could actually get into and dig into. You know, why is it that 14, 15, 16-year-old gay youth are getting involved with cigarette smoking? Because what we see, this is in the background of a 10% smoking prevalence in our county. So the smoking prevalence here is 5 times what we see in our county. This is crazy. So there's got to be some questions about how men get involved in smoking and how that behavior gets maintained over time. And it appears to be, you know, somewhat not linked with at all with much with ethnicity or race, but it is linked with use of cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamine. And this is the take home. So I'm going to be providing you some data here in a little bit about smoking among methamphetamine dependent men who were treated 20 years ago in a contingency management trial. Colby Pissarro is an emergency room physician. He's in his 2nd year now, but he was with us last summer, and he took our data and from 1996 or 97 and went to the death indexes and went and found all the dead people who participated in our original study. And what he saw here was very interesting, that if you were a cigarette smoker, independent of how you responded to the treatment, your hazard ratio was 5 times higher for dying than if you were a non-smoker. And if you look at the standardized mortality rate compared to average men in the population, you can see that being gay and a meth user, a 10-year standardized mortality rate, was about 4 times the rate of mortality, 20 years out, 3.3, so it resolves a little bit. The crude mortality rate was 2.3. If you added HIV with gay and meth, it was 5.2. But here's the kicker. So if you look out 20 years, you know, you still see a higher rate of meth plus HIV among gay men with mortality. But if you multiply this rate by 5 if you add tobacco use. So there is something, my next years of work before I retire is going to be looking at some of this biological stuff. I think there is a biological connection between nicotine plus methamphetamine plus or minus HIV that is particularly pathognomonic. I don't know what it is, but I don't believe it's just the behavioral aspects of things. And I'll kind of go through that, why I think that. Well, one of the reasons is because we know there are direct effects of substances of abuse on relevant HIV outcomes and parameters. We can see that methamphetamine launches pro-inflammatory cytokine release, cocaine increases entry and replication in quiescent T cells. Again, pro-inflammatory cytokine release in alcohol and cocaine. The one exception here is marijuana. Marijuana is a wet blanket to pro-inflammatory cytokines. So we see a reduction of pro-inflammatory cytokines and plasma viral load among people who are living with HIV. So I started down this path because I'm going to focus on this part here, because Charlie Hinken in 2007 published an important paper showing that stimulant users were non-compliant with their ART when they were using, but when they were not using, the red bar, their adherence was the same as non-drug users. So then the question comes up, well, how is it that you have this high rate of HIV incidence? How do you have all of this viremia going on? Because you start to see that you start to see this sort of change in behavior that's organized around methamphetamine. Clearly that could be the reason why you see differences, is because they tell you they're taking their medication and they lie. Or, you know, we also see with you add smoking, you get all kinds of bad things happening among people who are living with HIV. So what we did is we tested the question. This is an early study from Ellis that was done and published and showed that for HIV positive people who came in for their antiretroviral therapies, if you showed up in the clinic and you provided a meth negative urine tox screen, didn't matter what you said, whether you took meth or not, but if you provided urine that's documented no recent exposure to methamphetamine, your plasma viral load was suppressed and significantly less than people who were not on a heart. But if you came in with urine tox, there was no significant differences between groups. Your viral load would be about the same as if you were not on ART. So again, another question in my head about, well, what's going on? So we set up this study. Jen Fulcher, a brilliant infectious disease physician, published this. It was like giving birth to a cactus. But what we did, we got MSM, who were meth users, to come into clinic, and they would pee. And if they had negative urine or positive urine, we would take them into the colonoscopy suite. And we would do rectal biopsy, we took rectal fluids, we took peripheral markers of blood. And to make a long story short, what Jen was able to show was that for the guys who showed up, don't do that, it was a horrible study to do, but for the guys who showed up with positive methamphetamine urine taken into the colonoscopy suite, we saw a significant pro-inflammatory cytokine launch for in-gut fluid compared to those who did not use methamphetamine. It didn't matter whether you were HIV positive or negative, and it was not detected in circulating blood. The difference didn't hold to circulating blood. So there is some sort of compartment difference in how methamphetamine is affecting the body in this relation with this drug. First sort of thought. So then Jen said, well, what if we look at, and these are the data she has here for the IL-6, TNF, MIP1A, RANTES, the differences that were found. So then she said, well, what happens if we start looking at the microbiome? Once we're in there, let's just take some more swabs. So get some poop. And she did, and found certainly that there was differences in terms of sex practices and substance use on the intestinal microbiome in HIV positive folks, showing differences by whether you were someone who had oral semen exposure or oral semen ingestion, STIs, anal intercourse frequency. But then she also looked at whether there were differences by the specific kinds of drugs that people reported using and that were measured using urine. So what she was able to see for methamphetamine was a significant increase in microbiota that are the harmful, angry kinds. And among marijuana, the take home was a significant increase in the kinder, gentler microbiota. So just an interesting sort of difference that she saw as a result of this. So the take home from that is, yeah, when our folks are telling us that they're taking their medicine, yet you're measuring real biological medical differences, it could be something physical that's going on. At least that's what I'm thinking. In HIV positive folks, we see a lot of comorbidities and co-use of co-occurrence of psychiatric illness, drug use, and smoking. This is data from the M study cohort again, and you can see lots of overlapping cigarette smoking linked with a lot of bad things, including other drug use and psychiatric illness. This was an early study from the M study. We're now replicating these analyses to see whether this is a shift. And then Hilary Oralis in this paper did something where these are 3 bars. This is on prescription, adherent, and suppressed across these 3 different things for cigarette smoking, drug use, cigarette smoking, depression, psychiatric illness history, and drug use. And here we can see that if you had psychiatric illness, yes, you were less likely to have good outcomes on the care cascade. If you were a drug user, you also saw that there were some serious discrepancies in cascade outcomes, particularly suppressed, but also adherent for other drug use. But if you partial out marijuana from this group, here's what you see. You see that there's no difference between adherence and suppression in people who are HIV positive in the M study. These are visits, not people. These are visits over 6-month periods, but the consistent signal showing that methamphetamine and other drugs having more negative effects, negative associations with outcomes compared to marijuana is fascinating. And then finally, one of the questions I have is, you know, I'm gonna tell you the take home of this data. The take home from this slide is if you use methamphetamine, don't be a pig, okay? So if you, we went in and looked at methamphetamine visits across HIV positive and negative M study folks. These data are under review currently. We presented them at CROI last year. And what we saw was a stepwise ordered relationship for most bad things, with weekly or more frequent methamphetamine visits, less than monthly visits, less than weekly or monthly visits, and then no visits. And what you can see here is for unemployed, for unstable housing, been in jail, being a smoker, using heroin, using poppers, concurrent partners, and syphilis positive all had a stepwise significant ordered relationship between the exposure of methamphetamine and these negative outcomes, okay? So what I'm trying to get to is this dose response sort of association between the amount of methamphetamine that you're exposing your body, including your neurons, to actually matters. Where does it not matter? Well, age is you're older if you're using a lot of meth, and that's because you're likely to be positive, and there's some time you spend getting positive. You're more likely to be a binge drinker if you're less likely to be a binge drinker if you're a regular user, and equal likely to use another stimulant, cocaine. But it didn't matter. The dose had no difference on methamphetamine positive likelihood. So the dose response relationship holds up for most bad things, but not for HIV infection. So I'll summarize this part. Methamphetamine launches pro-inflammatory response in gut and brain and sensitizes to HIV infection. It may release control of viral suppression in HIV, particularly in gut, which is where the action happens. The gut flora is disturbed by methamphetamine in an opposite fashion to marijuana, and smoking is bad for everyone, but especially for meth using MSM living with HIV. So one of the questions is, once somebody gets started with using meth, what's a typical pattern of what happens? In our sample, what we see is that the good news is there doesn't seem to be an increasing trajectory. So you either start high and stay high, you start medium and stay medium, you start low or none and you stay none or low, or you might have a decreasing trajectory. The nice thing is it doesn't appear that the trajectory increases once it starts to drop. So an interesting question would be to find those folks, interview them, and find out what might be going on to guide their thinking about why they started to reduce their methamphetamine use. Methamphetamine use is linked with attributable fraction for HIV incidence in EXPLORE and in MAX. Oops. And we also see a generalized effect for stimulants with cocaine use showing links with HIV seroconversion among people who use injection drugs by Cora DeBeck's data in the Vancouver cohorts. The shameless plug. So this website here actually has the treatment response, the treatment manual, cognitive behavioral treatment manual, and the training manual for some data I'm going to be showing you. This also has the reback ethnography if you want to go download those materials. They're free. We're going to talk a little bit about the most potent treatment for stimulant use disorder at this point, and that is contingency management. If it were a medication, it would be the standard of care. And in fact, lately, it is now being used within the VA system for people who have cocaine use disorder. So it is starting to be taken up by some large systems of care, but as yet it has not been taken up by an independent for-profit healthcare or nonprofit healthcare agency. It tends to have an effect size of about 0.4 to 0.5, which is larger than many antibiotics. So just social math comparison. And it can be moved around in lots of different places. It's very flexible. It can be used all over the place in terms of facilitating treatment entry, like was done in Los Angeles and San Francisco. It can be helpful in treatment retention, compliance, in the middle of treatment, and abstinence from illicit drug use. Depends upon what you want to see happen. We ran a study. This is an oldie but goodie. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, but we randomly assigned 160 methamphetamine-dependent MSM in West Hollywood. That's from the death data follow-up. They went into 4 conditions: cognitive behavioral therapy, standard relapse prevention kind of stuff, a tailored case-specific cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, where we actually had increasing incentives delivered for methamphetamine-negative urine samples, and a combined CBT and contingency management condition. Contingency management, affectionately called peeing for dollars by our participants, actually was done. These were all observed urines. We had a viewing port above the toilet. There was a research assistant on the other side of the viewing port watching the man pee. So they were taken, it was hot urine taken right off the body and analyzed. What we found was that in 16 weeks, we had Monday, Wednesday, Friday visits, escalating incentives. You had 0 to 48 times that you could provide a urine sample. And up here we see that during treatment, during the 16 weeks, there's 16 times 3 is 48. So the average number of negative urine samples out of 48 visits, you can see that the yellow and green bars, the conditions containing contingency management, significantly outproduced the cognitive behavioral therapy in producing methamphetamine abstinence through time. At 1 year follow-up, they all look about the same, which is a whole other talk, and has to do with what's called the sleeper effect in cognitive behavioral therapy. They talk about it here in Seattle, the Alcohol Drug Abuse Institute. They talk a lot about the sleeper effect. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not, I don't know. But one of the nice things was that we saw something early on that's been replicated multiple times, showing that if you reduce methamphetamine use, you reduce unprotected sex. It kind of goes together. You take out methamphetamine use, you take out sex. So we kind of moved around thinking about, oh, what other things could we be doing with contingency management? Well, one of the things we did, Rafi Landovitz, some of you may know Rafi, actually said, well, what if we incentivized meth using MSM to provide negative meth urine for non-occupational post-exposure prophylaxis. And so he published these data showing that if you were on the contingency management program versus the control condition, which was a non-contingent delivery of resources that equated people across the 2 conditions, you saw that the link between the contingent behavior led to significant increases over the control in terms of completing the PEP regimen and adherence for PEP. So this raises some question about maybe there's some ideas that could be integrated with PrEP delivery and thinking about really non-adherent folks. It's certainly something we're thinking about, but we also want to build in that biological question as well to begin looking at gut and seeing what's happening with these non-adherent methamphetamine users. Stephanie Strathby and Tom Patterson took a motivational interviewing and had it made into 2 different groups. One that's a 5-session for HIV positive MSM and one for a 4-session version of the same thing for HIV negative heterosexual men. This is the positive data showing that the significant increase and sustained increase in percent of protected sex over the discussion and education group out to 1 year. These are the contents of what we've talked about in the sessions. But really kind of, this is also one of my take-homes here, is some early work that was done by Phil Coffin and Grant Colfax in San Francisco with mirtazapine at 30 milligrams. What he was able to show was that if you give methamphetamine using gay men 30 milligrams of methamphetamine once daily at the evening, you would see a significant reduction in methamphetamine use over time compared to placebo. Okay? Really clear, this is 30 and 30. You also saw the same sort of thing we saw, which is that if you knock out this methamphetamine use, you sort of also see the knocking out of high-risk sex. So he hasn't published it yet, but he presented the findings of the replication trial, 120 patient trial, 60 and 60, at CPDD, the College on Problems of Drug Dependence, this summer, and basically found exactly the same slope on the line. Okay, some people are giving him grief because it doesn't hit a home run and say, oh, if you take this pill, you'll put down the meth pipe. It doesn't say that. It says that if you take this pill, you'll put down the meth pipe somewhat. Okay, we have examples of this in addiction medicine. Naltrexone for alcohol use is not used to instill alcohol abstinence. It's marketed on reduction of heavy drinking days. So in terms of thinking about how a medication might be changing behavior, this one is something to think about using, particularly among MSM, that there is a replication in a larger trial with the same slope that's going to come out soon in terms of he'll get it published somewhere, somewhere good. But it's certainly something that we can say at the end of the day that we've not been able to say for 20 years. And it's a very exciting thing to think about. There are really, some people get really not happy about the issues of, Mirtazapine 30 milligrams causing weight gain, particularly in MSM. But in talking with Philip, one of the things I've asked him is, how do you get your guys to take this drug? And he says, well, one of the advantages of mirtazapine is also a sedating antidepressant. So if you take it at the end of the day, it actually counters one of the significant problems of withdrawing from amphetamine, which is sleep disruption. So you can sort of swap one bad thing for the other, okay, or a good thing for a bad thing. You may put on a little weight, or maybe you need to go to the gym, but you'll sleep better, and you'll have a little bit better mood. So just something to think about. But one of the take-homes here is in addiction medicine, what we do is when behavioral therapies don't work, we consider adding a medication. This actually does give you a next step to think about when working with patients who are not responding to standard behavioral therapies. My colleague, Kathy Reback, has been doing some theory-based text messages for stimulant use and stimulant using gay men. These are outstanding texts. I can tell you, they're fun to read. They're theoretically derived. One of the things that happened in doing this work with her is that the guys who get these texts can't tell whether this is a canned message or whether it's an actual human being. So I've looked at the transcripts of what happens when they type back, and they'll be talking about like, hey, this is so cool, and they'll be talking to canned messages, but, and they can't tell the difference, which is a fascinating thing to think about as you're doing your commute. In terms of looking at whether it has an effect, the bars on the left, these are days, so lower bars are better. You can see that the assessment condition seems to do about as well as assessment only, as opposed to text with a human or text automatically. The text with the automatic is the orange and the blue is with the human. But when you look at the reduction of sex on meth, you start to see this, you start to see the orange bars starting to show their effect at 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months down the road. That the text actually seemed to reduce the number significantly of meth on sex. Of course, these are non-treatment seeking men. These are men who are just interested in doing something with their meth issue. Adam Carrico published this data. He's doing a lot with this, taking contingency management and integrating a mood management program, affect regulation program called Artemis. And those are all the things he does in 8 sessions with folks. And you can see here that there's a significant difference in sessions 3 and 5 in terms of reduction of positive affect by integrating the Artemis, or increasing positive affect when you use this condition, with a significant increase in positive affect and mindfulness at 3 months. So, these are not big changes. They don't make you go happy and that sort of thing. And, the whole issue of those of you who may have worked with stimulant users is they're not necessarily the best at behavior change school. They tend to not want to sit long. So it's just something to think about. So in terms of responding to our folks, what are our strategies? Well, the data that I presented today is that contingency management works. We can argue about how you implement it or where. Matt We did that great trial with Tim and showed that if you take it to the STD clinic and people who are not interested in behavior change, it doesn't work at all, period, zero. But if you take it and you move it into other areas where people are interested in doing something around their meth use, it'll work. So we've done this now also in Cape Town, South Africa. So it's like, it's cross-culture. It seems to be something that's linked with brain and how it works. And we're certainly looking at that as well. It is the most effective tool on the shelf for reducing meth use, particularly among MSM. Reducing meth use, particularly in high-risk groups, reduces HIV transmission, and it improves HIV prevention medication adherence. Affect regulation is something to consider. It may boost contingency management outcomes for HIV positive men. Active meth users benefit from brief motivational interviewing and reducing sex risk behaviors, and that's true for both men and heterosexuals, MSM and heterosexuals. And then finally, the real contribution here is mirtazapine reduces meth use, not abstinence, and sexual risk behaviors. Remember to reinforce smoking cessation no matter what you're doing. Pay attention. If somebody's smoking, you can always just say, you know, I see you smoke. Have you ever thought of quitting? It's really a way to save a life. I will give you a PS on this, and that is that in the next while, you're going to probably hear that there's another medication we may be bringing into the armamentarium. So I can't go into the details yet because we're just getting this published, but you know, it will be things that are not too terribly expensive, and is not necessarily going to make us all go home happy, but it'll have effect sizes that look something like the mirtazapine, but it'll be something that we have, that'll be another option that we may be able to think about. So, and we have a whole series of new applications of medications coming along. One of the problems with doing a medication study with methamphetamine dependent people is that their disorder interferes with them taking a pill. So the more that we can get into long-acting formulations on medications that can address stimulant dependence, the more likely we are to be able to change behavior and measure changes in behavior, which leads to the science fiction part, which is, and once we have that, then we can co-formulate that with HIV medications so that you actually can do a one-stop shop. So you're addressing not only the group of folks who can take their medications, but also have an option for people who need more help in adhering to their HIV treatment and prevention regimen. Yeah.
I have a question. In this area that you were actually just alluding to, a patient of mine last week was talking about I am naltrexone for his meth use disorder, and has found some success with it. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so the question is, somebody found relief from using an injectable naltrexone product, Vivitrol, right? So would that possibly have a reason to work for methamphetamine? Yes. So the medications we're working with is a combination pharmacotherapy of extended release naltrexone plus high dose bupropion. So it could be that, you know, either part of the combination could be working, or it could be something about the combination that might be helpful, or, you know, we don't know. But, you know, I think your patient could be telling you something that he actually feels. Did he say more about how qualitatively it made it change for him? Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, that was a great talk, Steve. So I've been offering people mirtazapine since Grant published that paper in 2011, and I don't feel like it's been great. Like, very few people have used it. Mostly they stop it. And I think part of the problem is that it's kind of a one-off and it's not a very strong intervention, and that given that all of the interventions are pretty weak, that we probably need to combine them in a more purposeful way. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about that and how you can kind of start doing that at a clinic level, at an operational level, rather than relying on each of us to do our own thing, which is kind of, I think, what we do in Madison.
Great question, Matt. So one of the things I think that we learned from using naltrexone for alcohol use disorder was not to think about the medication working for any particular patient, but to think of it working for the population. And so just having a population approach, you're not going to know which one is going to get it. So by by having that be a practice guideline that you have to use the medication, at some point, is I think the stronger way to go in terms of an individual medication. These folks are particularly disturbed by the chaotic influence of methamphetamine use or early withdrawal or the longer abstinence syndrome. So on any given day, the chance they're going to take a medication is not likely. So that's the second part of this is mirtazapine may have a bigger effect size if we could actually just force it down the gullet. It's like no medication works if you don't take it. So it's like we do have a challenge there. Yeah.
Steve, could you talk a little bit about the prize-based contingency management versus whatever the regular kind is, what your considerations are, and if the sleeper effect happens with prize-based as well as the regular?
That's a great question, Julie. So the prize-based contingency management, I don't have too much experience with. I just have always found that the effect size of providing those increasing reinforcers is so big, you don't need to be a scientist to watch it work. It's just boom, it happens, like first day. And if it doesn't happen, it's kind of like what we were talking about, Matt, it doesn't happen. For people who have more of this disorder, it's hard to get 48 hours of clean time. So it's really tough to do. The prize-based is where you have a fishbowl or some other sort of container, and inside the container may be 100 slips of paper. And if you provide a urine sample today, you might get 3 pulls from the fishbowl. If you provide a urine sample on Wednesday, you get 5 samples. And if you get a negative sample on Friday, you get 7 samples plus a bonus. So you have increasing numbers of chances to win prizes from the fishbowl. And the odds are stacked against you in terms of the high value prizes. So color TV may be the high value prize, but there may be 1 slip in there. So you have to get that. The other, half of the slips say good job. That's what they're implementing within the VA. Is that sort of prize-based thing. Nancy Petrie developed that. She's brilliant. Unfortunately, she was taken from us far too soon. But she's done a very nice job of showing. And in fact, there are some metrics that show that you can go down the place where contingency management stops working across stimulant using groups is around $200 for the treatment program, whether you deliver using incentives or whether you deliver using these prizes. So much lower than that, and people are not motivated to change their behavior. And certainly as you move up, you start to get more behavior change as the richer schedule comes along. But it is also, there's a whole literature on that about, if you wanted to have $300 per patient sort of episode, you can go to literature and find out what kind of works best with that. Oh, but the other part was, there is no sleeper effect. So this is actually, contingency management works when it's implemented. When you withdraw it, it stops working. So the issue you saw there, it was like the same outcomes at 1 year for the cognitive behavioral therapy as opposed to the contingency management, which is consistent with my thinking about medications. A medication works when it's on board. When you take the medication off, it stops working. So I like to keep that same sort of rigorous thinking about these interventions. And so, because addiction is a chronic relapsing condition, and one treatment is not going to get us there for whatever drug we're working with.
Do you know if it's possible to bill for contingency management to offset the cost of the prizes?
It is not possible to bill currently for contingency management in private health insurance. It is possible to implement contingency management within the VA. So they're doing it there, but that's not like Blue Cross or Kaiser is the one I have in my crosshairs to get started with. Because I think that they should be able to do this, because there's clear cost benefit to implementing this and reducing healthcare costs as people reduce their methamphetamine use. As we saw, there's a dose response sort of thing. But that's also, a lot of folks are really organizing within the behavioral therapy community, which I'm not a member of. I'm sort of at the edge of the community, that they're organizing with that as the next goal. There's some ethical issues or something with the community, with the insurance policies, paying people. You pay for your insurance policy and then you earn some of it back. you know, which doesn't seem to be a problem for a lot of other conditions, but for addiction it is. That's right. Yeah, exactly. or cholesterol control. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Because, you know, in terms of funding prizes, we're going to operationalize it and build truly a max clinic for people that are not adherent with HIV. And they actually offer money
Yes.
for undetectable viral load.